nuclear reaction happens deep inside the sun, where hydrogen atoms are fused into helium. Then their heat and light is radiated into space, and 90 million miles it shines upon the Earth's face. For every 100 calories that shines up from the sun, the calories are green plus rap will number only one. But every single calorie in ocean, hills, and plains will serve as a foundation for a living food chain. At the bottom of the food chain are producers like green plants, whose cells make food from sunlight, making use of chloroplasts. It happens in the pines and flowers on your windowsill, 'cause every single green plant's got a little chlorophyll. Well, the next up in a food chain is a primary consumer, an herbivore, a cow, or vegetarian baby boomer. A primary consumer spends its mealtime eating plants. It might be a buffalo or might be an ant. Each level in a food chain yields only 10% of the former level's energy. You might as swear it one. There are bones and leaves you can't suggest that really make a dent. And don't ignore the weight and cost of metabolic rent. So if your plants are yielding about 100 calories, your yield will only be 10 in the birdies and the bees. And 700 calories in algae in the sea. Primary consumers, it will yield you 70. Some other ways of getting food are really out of sight. You can be a predator or be a parasite. A predator eats meat, a parasite eats your insides. And if you're a decomposer, you will leave me when I die. And if you know this about food chains, you can really take the cake. When energy goes through, it doesn't last, it dissipates. The nutrients in food chains meet a very different fate. They recycle and they circulate forever, ain't that great? Just remember there's no beings in this world that live alone. Populations form communities where all do make their home. Though your niche may be determined in the role that you are playing, every creature alive or dead is in the food chain.
Hey guys, this is Mr. Mahmood and you are watching video 2 of the Ecology unit. In this one we're going to just focus in on a few major categories. But one of those categories is one of my favorites. As you guys should know by now, I am proudly full-blooded Egyptian, so we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects. Pyramids! Yeah. Alright, well, obviously we're not going to talk about the pyramids that are in Giza, but we're going to talk about the ones that represent flow of a few different things, whether we refer to energy, biomass, or numbers. We call these ecological pyramids. So we're going to get into those. We're also going to briefly walk through some basic labels for organizations, level of organization, starting with a single organism up and how they're grouped. So we'll get to those as well. Let's get started by talking about pyramids. Now, first off, the song that you saw at the beginning of the video hopefully was a good review for a lot of the things we hit in the first video, and it actually did introduce some of the things we'll talk about in this one pretty well. So let's refer to that as much as you can. Think back to that song that you heard if you hear something that sounds similar. Alright, there are 3 types of pyramids that we're going to refer to. One of them is called an energy pyramid, another is called a numbers pyramid, and the third is called a biomass pyramid. So an energy pyramid is exactly what it sounds like. It represents the flow of energy. Now we've talked about food chains before. You see the food chain here that we mentioned in the previous video. Food chain travels typically, in the picture you see here, goes from left to right. The producer starts in the first trophic level, the primary consumer or the herbivores in the second, secondary consumers in the third, tertiary in the fourth, and you see how it continues on. If I wanted to show this food chain in representation of a pyramid, all I have to do is just turn it up vertically. So always just think of a typical food chain from left to right. Just imagine flipping it from bottom to top. Think of all of these different types of pyramids just like if you were building your own pyramid. If I was building a pyramid, I'm not going to start with the top brick, right? I always have to start at the base and build my way up. So the same thing's true for all of these pyramids. At the base is where you're going to have the first trophic level, then the second trophic level will be above that, and so on. So our producers are always at the base. Primary consumer or herbivore above that, secondary consumer or the carnivore would be above that, tertiary consumer, top carnivore maybe would be above that, and you continue to go. Okay, so in an energy pyramid, literally you're representing the flow of energy from one trophic level to the next. Now you guys should remember with the 10% rule, you'll always have more energy at the level below than the level above. So if you start at the base with our producers, you'll have 100% of the energy level. Then say that mouse, we talked about it before, only gets 10% of that energy. then the snake gets 10% of that, which would be 1%, and then the hawk would get 10% of that, which is 0.1%. So if the width of each level represents the amount of energy that's at each level, the bottom or the base will always be the widest. Since it's the producers, it has 100% of its own energy, since it's making its own energy. And then as you move up, each level is going to have less and less energy, so it's going to get more and more narrow. So every pyramid of energy looks exactly like a typical pyramid. You'll always have the lowest, the producer level, the widest, and it narrows out until you get to the most narrow at the top. So energy pyramids are always going to be in a typical pyramid shape. There are no exceptions to that rule. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other two that we're going to talk about, numbers and biomass pyramids, mostly follow the same pattern. The most of each one will typically be at the base, the widest, and then as you move up, it narrows out from there. But there are exceptions to the other two pyramids where it may not look like that perfect pyramid shape. Numbers and biomass pyramids don't always have that shape, but an energy pyramid will always have its widest at the base and always get more narrow to the top. So let's keep that in mind. Alright, so we talked about an energy pyramid already. Always starts with the widest at the base, 100% of the energy, and works its way up. The other two are called a numbers pyramid and a biomass pyramid. A numbers pyramid is, again, exactly what it sounds like. I'm not trying to confuse you here. A numbers pyramid represents the number of organisms at each trophic level within a given ecosystem. So let's think about that first food chain that we mentioned before. I'll go back. We start with the plant, then the mice or the mouse, the snake, and the hawk. If I represented this in a numbers pyramid, you should understand, remember, that mouse has to eat more than one blade of grass to survive for a long period of time, right? So if it's going to survive in an ecosystem, there have to be multiple blades of grass for any one mouse. So there are going to be a whole lot more blades of grass than there are mice. So if I look at a numbers pyramid, the wider it is, the higher the number of those organisms in that given space. So the bottom, the producer level, will have the highest number of organisms. The mice have to be less, because remember, each mouse is eating multiple blades of grass. Same thing's true for the snakes. There cannot be a higher snake population than there are mice. Or if that is the case, then the snake population are quickly going to die out. In a sustainable ecosystem, the mice population has to be significantly larger than the snakes, because just like the mouse to the grass, a snake is going to eat multiple mice. So there have to be more mice than there are snakes. Same thing's true for the hawk. There have to be more snakes than there are hawks. So a typical numbers pyramid, again, just like an energy pyramid, has the most at the producer level, and it significantly drops as you work your way up. That's usually the case. There's an exception to the rule that we'll get to here in a minute. The third one is called a biomass pyramid. I'll go back to the same slide before we talk about these variations here. If we look at the same food chain that you see here, a biomass pyramid literally represents, let's break down the word biomass. Bio means living, right? Mass means weight, basically, weight with gravity. So the living tissue, the literal amount or the mass of living tissue within any given space at any given time for each trophic level is what we consider the biomass. So if you took all the blades of grass at any given time, you took a snapshot of that ecosystem, took all the blades of grass, snapped them off the ground and weighed them, and got a specific mass, that would be the value that would represent the first trophic level. Took all the mice within that population, weighed them, that would be the biomass at the second trophic level. Weighed all the snakes would be the biomass at the third, and if you weigh all the hawks, it would be the biomass at the fourth. And again, most biomass pyramids, just like anything else, because the numbers are the way they are, typically have the highest mass at the bottom, the producer, then it drops as you move up. So again, most biomass pyramids have that basic pyramid shape. But again, just like the numbers pyramid, there is an exception to the rule. So let's talk about some of the exceptions. Let's start with this aquatic ecosystem. Aquatic, as you should know, means water or oceanic. So we're talking about oceans usually when we talk about aquatic ecosystems. The producers in aquatic ecosystems usually aren't plants. They're usually types of algae, possibly like cyanobacteria, things like that. Whatever the producer is that population is going to be at the first trophic level. The second trophic level are the herbivores that feed off of those producers, whether, depending on the category and the parts of the ocean, they can be several different things. But the herbivores, what feeds off of that producer, then our primary consumer feeds off of that, and secondary can feed off of that. For the purpose of discussion here, let's use some basic examples. In the producer level, I'm going to use the numbers pyramid here at the top as the example. We usually discuss phytoplankton as the most plentiful and most abundant producer in an aquatic ecosystem. So I'm going to represent phytoplankton by writing PP here. Phytoplankton. It's probably the only time this year you're going to hear me say PP a lot, right? So phytoplankton are represented there at the first trophic level. The second trophic level will be something that feeds off of it. A lot of times there's another type of plankton that feeds off of it, but not to confuse you there. Let's just say we'll call this krill, okay? Krill are like very, very small shrimp, right? All right, so we have krill, I'll represent that with a K, that feed off of the phytoplankton. So the krill are our primary consumers, or herbivores. Let's say we have small fish that feed off of the krill. Since I'm writing in red, I'll do it off to the side. SF represents small fish here. And then at the top of this food chain, we'll just say large fish, right? So I'll use an LF to represent large fish here. So these are the organisms that we're talking about within the different pyramids here. The same organisms are represented in each pyramid here. With a numbers pyramid, as you can imagine, there's, like we said before, more phytoplankton than there are krill. There's more krill than there are small fish, more small fish than there are large fish, because each one of the organisms at the higher trophic level feeds off of multiple ones of the trophic level below it. So numbers pyramids look just like what you would expect. The majority of, or the highest population, the highest number of organisms in a given space at a given time is at the producer level. As you move up, it gets more narrow because there are fewer at each trophic level. If you go all the way down, drop down to the energy pyramid, you see the same progression, because every single time the energy pyramid will be the same. 100% of the energy is at the base. The phytoplankton make their own, so they have 100% of energy available. The krill feed off of the phytoplankton. Because of the 10% rule, they only get 10% of that energy. Small fish get 10% of that, or 1%. Large fish get 0.1%. So you see the energy pyramid has that same shape as the numbers pyramid, just like you would expect. Now the biomass pyramid is where you see the exception. So let's think about this. Everything's great from the primary consumer up. From our krill in the blue, up to the small fish, up to the large fish, everything's the same. But you'll notice the key here is our producer level. This thing looks kind of like a Christmas tree, right? Because the producer level is not the widest. So we have to think about this. We said biomass pyramids represent the literal mass of living tissue at a given place at a given time. So it's like a snapshot of that producer level at that given place. So think about it this way. In an aquatic ecosystem, phytoplankton, because they're so small, are eaten at incredible rates by our primary consumers. So the primary consumer, the krill in this example, eats a whole lot of phytoplankton at any given time. So if I take an actual snapshot of the available phytoplankton within an ecosystem, it doesn't look like there's very much, because the amount that's reproducing is just barely higher than the amount that's being eaten. In order for the population to survive, right, it has to be able to reproduce more than it dies. But it's just barely when we talk about aquatic ecosystems, because phytoplankton are so small and they're eaten at such a fast rate, quick rate, by our primary consumers. So let's say that phytoplankton reproduce at a rate of 10,000 phytoplankton per hour, whereas they're eaten at a rate of 9,000 phytoplankton per hour. So if I were to just take a snapshot of how much phytoplankton there is in that ecosystem, how much would you say I have based on that math? 10,000 are being reproduced, or 10,000 are being, let's say, available at that time. About 9,000 of them are being eaten. So the difference is all you're officially going to see at any given time. So that difference is just about 1,000 organisms. So even though they're representing 10,000 of a population within them, because so much of them are being eaten so fast, at any given time it doesn't look like there's very much. So our first trophic level here, this small green space here representing the population, representing the biomass of these phytoplankton, doesn't seem very big because it's eaten at such a fast rate. Now the problem obviously would occur if it's being eaten at a rate that's either at or above the rate that it's reproducing. Now you're eliminating the producer population, which means there is no sugar available for the rest of the ecosystem, and the whole ecosystem would crumble. It wouldn't survive. So it's a very specific balance in an aquatic ecosystem that, yes, the primary consumers feed off of the phytoplankton very quickly, but it has to be able to reproduce slightly faster at a slightly higher rate than it's being eaten, so that there's always at least that little bit of extra so that the population can continue to reproduce and continue to thrive. Okay, so a biomass pyramid may not look like that perfect shape if we're talking about an aquatic ecosystem. So an aquatic ecosystem, the numbers in the energy pyramid are the same, both very normal. The producer is the widest and it narrows as you move up. But in a biomass pyramid, because it's talking about at a fast rate they're being eaten, the difference is all you're seeing. Alright, now let's talk about the same shape of pyramid, but now we're talking about a different environment and a different type of pyramid. In a temperate forest or any kind of a forest ecosystem, the biomass pyramid is actually just like the energy pyramid. Right? So let's think about what's at each trophic level here. I'll use the biomass pyramid as the example. At the base, we're going to have trees. Okay? I'll represent that with a T. Alright? Because we're talking about a forest. The producers, at the most part, they're obviously all types of vegetation. We'll use trees as the example here. Eating the trees, we'll say, are insects. Right? Insects are our primary consumers in this forest. So insects feed off of all different characteristics of the trees, the leaves, the bark, whatever it might be. Then we'll say we have small animals feeding off of the insects. I'll use an SA for that. And then large animals eating the small animals, right? So these are the four organisms that we're going to talk about, one at each trophic level within this pyramid, or all three of these pyramids. Now the energy pyramid at the base, just like always, will have the highest energy available at the first trophic level. The trees make their own energy, so they represent 100% of the energy. The insects that feed off of them only get 10%. Small animals only get 1%. Large animals get 0.1%. So our energy pyramid looks just like it always does. The biomass pyramid in this case looks like the normal pyramid because, as you hopefully can imagine, the trees, each individually, are very heavy. They have a substantial amount of biomass. So each tree brings with it a significant amount of biomass. So definitely the highest biomass would be at the producer level. If you take all the insects and weigh them together, they're not nearly as much biomass as the trees that they feed off of. So we do see, again, a very typical pyramid if we're looking at a forest ecosystem. The most biomass is at the producer level with the trees. The insects will be the second level and have about the second highest biomass because of the numbers being relatively high. Obviously, think about how many insects there are on any given tree. Then as you move up, small animals take up a little less biomass, and the large animals less as well. So the difference here, and the exception to the rule, comes with the numbers pyramid. If you look at that numbers pyramid, this is the one that looks different. This is the one that looks like the biomass pyramid in the aquatic ecosystem. Let's think about why that's the case. If we're talking about the number of organisms within an ecosystem, then we're basically just doing a count, right? So within any given space, think about the number of trees available, think about the number of primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary. And hopefully you understand that any given tree is very large. That one tree can house hundreds of thousands of insects, all feeding off of that one tree. So even though in terms of biomass, the tree biomass is significant and is more than enough to be able to substantiate feeding off by the insects and still have a whole lot left over, that it still represents all of that biomass in the ecosystem. But by number, there may only be a few trees within that ecosystem. So the trees here in that first trophic level, in the producer level, aren't that many. There aren't that many trees. Each tree has a whole lot of biomass and a whole lot of energy available, but their numbers aren't that high. So the number of trees may be relatively small. The number of insects feeding off of the trees will be significantly higher, because remember, there could be hundreds of thousands of insects off of just one tree. Then we get kind of back to normal. The number of small animals would be less than the number of insects because a small animal eats multiple insects. The same thing's true for the large animal, eats multiple small animals, so there will be a higher number of small animals than there are large. So once you get past that first trophic level with a forest ecosystem, the numbers pyramid looks just like anything else. But the first trophic level is significantly smaller in the numbers pyramid because we're talking about the producers being very, very large. They're trees, so there aren't that many of them compared to the primary consumers above them. So make sure you're comfortable with the three types of pyramids, the difference between them, and the exceptions to the rules that say a numbers pyramid and a biomass pyramid will always have the basic pyramid shape with the widest and the most of each at the first trophic level. That's not always the case. In an aquatic ecosystem, the biomass pyramid looks a little different. The producers are relatively small because the difference of what's being or what's surviving compared to what's being eaten is all that's being shown. And in a forest ecosystem, the numbers pyramid has the producer level very small because the number of trees relative to the insects that feed off of them is very small, very low, because each tree is very large. It has a lot of biomass to account for the insects, but it itself is very small in number. All right, so make sure you know the difference between the three. The last thing we're going to talk about here are the basic levels of organization. We'll start with one single organism, one living thing by itself, and then branch off talking about what you would categorize all these different groups as. So if we start with the organism as one living thing by itself, we'll branch off from there. A good example, before we jump too far, that was a picture of the zebra there. We'll use that as the development. Let's use another example. Let's say that we're using you as the organism. Remember, an organism is something that's living. So if we start with you, you're the organism. Wave. You should be very proud. So you're the organism. Now let's think about you being grouped into a small group, right? Let's say that you are now part of the group that is my class, right? So if I'm talking about my class, I'm still referring to you because you're part of my class. But now I'm not only referring to you, I'm talking about you plus all of your classmates, right? Now let's get a little further. Let's say I'm talking about the 9th grade class, everybody that's in 9th grade. I'm still talking about you, I'm still talking about my class, but now I'm talking about all of 9th grade, so people that I will probably never talk to and never even see. But they're part of this group that also includes my class and also includes you. And we keep getting bigger. Let's say now I'm talking about all Williams students. Now I'm incorporating 9th and 10th grade, but I'm still talking about you, I'm still talking about my class, and I'm talking about the whole 9th grade class as well. And we get bigger and bigger and bigger. You see how it works. Every time we expand, it includes the ones before it, but now we're talking about a larger category as we go through. So we're going to talk about the same thing with ecosystems. We start with a single organism, right? If you have a lot of organisms that all are of the same species, they're all capable of producing viable offspring, now we use the term population. You've heard population a lot, I'm sure. If I ask you for the population of Plano, what do you think about? Do you think about how many blades of grass there are, how many trees there are, how many rabbits there are? A lot of rabbits in Plano. Dogs, cats, insects. Do you think about all of those things? You don't, right? If I ask you the population of Plano, you think people. Right? I'm not sure what the population is, probably like 300,000, something like that. People is the category that you're dealing with when we typically talk about population. So population is focusing on one particular species. We just happen to talk about humans, but it could be the population of zebras in this picture, population of blades of grass. All of those things are accurate because a population are organisms of the same species. Okay? Beyond the population is a community. So now we're talking about, as hopefully you can guess by the picture, more than one species. So if we have multiple populations in a given place at a given time, that's what we consider a community. So I brushed over it before, but a population is organisms of the same species. To be part of the same species, that means you have to be so genetically similar that two of the sex cells or the gametes can actually combine to produce a viable offspring. You can't just take a random sperm cell and a random egg cell from two different species of organisms, put them together and hope for the best. They're not going to fuse together. They're not going to produce any sort of viable offspring if they're not extremely close to each other, if not identical to each other. So that connection to be able to produce offspring is what defines organisms as being in the same species. Obviously it has to be a male with a female, but you get what I'm talking about. So if organisms are part of the same species, that's a population. So once I start incorporating different species, now I'm referring to the community. So if I mention the community of Plano, I'm actually not just talking about the human population. I'm talking about the humans, dogs, cats, blades of grass, trees, insects, everything that's living within that given area. Notice I said living. So all living populations in a given place at a given time is what we consider the community. So all biotic factors of an ecosystem would be described as a community. So abiotic factors, remember non-living factors, things like earth, the atmospheric air, water, clouds, all those, the solar energy, the things we talked about in the first video, the abiotic factors are not part of the community. So now we're into the point where we've talked about everything that's living within a given space at a given time. Once I also incorporate the abiotic factors, everything that's living and non-living, now I'm talking about the ecosystem. So it's not just living, not just the community, and it's not just one species, but it's all populations of all species, plus all abiotic factors, the earth, ground, solar energy, atmospheric air, all of that. So all components within any given area at a given time is what we consider an ecosystem. And then finally, if you take all of the ecosystems on Earth where life is possible, living things can survive, you take every single ecosystem within our planet, then we talk about the biosphere. So if we talk about levels of organization, let's go back and do this one more time. We'll start with the organism as one living thing by itself. Then the population is all the organisms of the same species within a given place at a given time. A community is all of the different populations, so all the different species of living things within a given place at a given time, all of the biotic factors of an ecosystem. And then the ecosystem itself would not only be biotic, but also the abiotic factors, living and non-living factors within an ecosystem. Until now, you get all the ecosystems, all the areas on Earth where life is possible. Now you're ending up with the biosphere, which is anywhere where life is capable on Earth. Okay, so just make sure you're comfortable with the levels of organization, starting with a single organism and working your way up. By the time we get to the spring, we'll start with the organism and actually go down. Talk about what's within an organism, and we're going to get much more internal in the second semester. First semester, really more about kind of big picture, at least in this unit. So big picture from here: organism, population, community, ecosystem, biosphere. 3 types of pyramids: energy pyramid, numbers pyramid, biomass pyramid. Know the difference between the 3. Energy is always going to be in that pyramid shape, starting with the first trophic level at the bottom, working its way up. Biomass and numbers pyramid are usually the same way, but remember the exceptions for both rules. Alright guys, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you later.